Do you want to check out ITProTV but aren't ready to commit? We're making a few episodes from our most popular courses free for you to try here on YouTube so you can see what they're all about. Enjoy this episode and head over to ITPro.tv when you're ready to see the full course.
Welcome back to the CISSP Accelerated series here at ITProTV, and today we're going to accelerate you into some security governance concepts and evaluations on what we're doing, why we do this, how it works, and a lot of the ins and outs that go around with the idea of security governance. Yeah, all around. There's plenty of it to go around, let me put it that way.
There is.
We'll go ahead and jump right into this thing.
Okay.
Adam, let's start off with the idea of basically setting our definitionals, right? We have to have the same conversation. So what is information security governance or management?
Governance and management. Let's actually talk about both because they are kind of related. Even though we often think of them as being synonymous with one another, there is actually a difference. And so when we think about governance, we think about all-up, high-level guidance coming from senior management, typically also being filtered from outside the organization from a regulatory and or statutory standpoint. And that guidance that we are thinking about, that we are getting in terms of governance, is really helping us to understand how to act with due care and how to oversee things, pay attention to them, if you will, with due diligence. Two very important, critical vocabulary terms. You're going to hear me and Daniel talk about them quite a bit throughout our time together across all 8 domains of the CISSP CBK, due diligence and due care. And when we think about governance, we often associate governance more broadly with risk and compliance. You hear us talk often about GRC activities, governance, risk, and compliance activities. And all of these are kind of bundled together, along with due care and due diligence, up under the idea of information security management. Risk management is often how we hear this referred to. But broadly, the idea of governance is the idea of applying oversight to the activities of an organization, typically being described, documented, and pushed out through high-level policy statements of intent and focus coming from senior management that lay down the law, if you will, that give us the rails that allow us to operate, but stay, as we often hear people say, in our lanes, right? And make sure we're doing what we need to do. That is due diligence, oversight, and governance, and acting in the appropriate ways that align with business requirements. That is due care. And so we want to make sure we're thinking about all these terms as we begin to take on and kind of answer Daniel's initial question about governance. But he also challenged us to really think about information security management. So I want to give you a quick definition of that. Then I want to bring Daniel back in and make sure he's comfortable, as well as you being comfortable, with the distinction here, because it is a really important one. So
wrap me with a warm sweater, Adam.
I'm just going to make you feel all warm and fuzzy about this. So information security management, right? We've talked about governance kind of all up high level. But information security management is really this idea of looking at and validating those policies we just talked about, right? The appropriate policies that communicate intent, give us guidance, help us to understand the application of governance, as we were talking about, procedure, standards, and guidelines, all of that together, and ensuring they're implemented in such a way to ensure business operations are conducted in such a way that they meet with and ultimately address acceptable levels of risk. So information security management is really about taking the approach that we want to minimize or mitigate risk, terms that you often hear me refer to and use when we talk about risk. Want to minimize or mitigate risk in the organization through standards, procedures, guidelines, and policies, giving that governance, that guidance, and ultimately providing our ability to have due diligence, oversight, and act with due care. And by doing this together, we frame this up, kind of roll it up under information security management, we begin to really create this opportunity for all of us, whether we're senior managers in the organization, providing that policy guidance. Remember, policy answers questions associated with why we're doing something and what we're looking to accomplish. High-level strategic statements of intent. We'll talk about and define the idea of standards, procedures, and guidelines a little bit later on in other episodes. But for now, let's just assume that all of them become important as we think about strategic, operational, and tactical ways in which we engage and provide this guidance. And strategy is really aligned with policy. Operational elements are aligned with this idea of mid-level management translating our policies, and creating the opportunity through due diligence and oversight to then have people below, as we delegate down, execute through procedures and exercise due care. And that would be tactical at the point or tip of the spear when they execute. And so we want to begin to think about framing all these things and discussing them together. So let's check back in with Daniel. Let's see what's going on with our definitions. Let's make sure we're all comfortable with where we are before we really take on any new ideas. So what are you thinking?
I was waning, and then you used the word tactical, and I was right back in. Sunk my teeth into this.
I saw you were like really sharpening the knife off camera while we were talking. Right?
No, it's really good. Now that we understand what we mean when we say information security management, and also what kind of governance the idea behind that is. So let's move on. Since this is basically laws, how am I supposed to operate? How am I supposed to work? And what do those things look like? How do I know that I'm doing that correctly? Is this the idea of like a security framework? Is that what those are intended for?
So it is, in one respect, and probably the best way to think about it just generically, right, and absolutely to say yes. But security frameworks definitely give us that guidance, right, as you were suggesting, helps us to put together all these things and make sure we're doing those things and understanding how to do them in the right way. It acts as a reference point, so it's really important for us to state that and be aware of that. Allows us to share information, creating relevancy through broadly and widely documenting and communicating unequivocally what the expectation is. As Daniel suggested, this has probably become a thing that we're doing because of regulatory or statutory compliance concerns, essentially a law that says we have to do something, or a regulation says we have to do something a certain way. And as a result of that, there really is not a lot of opportunity there for misinterpretation, for misdirection or mismanagement, because as a result of that, there's probably fines and perhaps even jail time that can be applied if we don't do the things we have to do and meet those requirements. So a framework is going to help us to understand how to shape our responses, because it's going to give us that standardized, documented approach. It is an element and ultimately is going to sit right at the base, at the bedrock of what we talk about when we think about creating the culture of security within an organization. The framework, often referred to more broadly as the Enterprise Security Architecture, the ESA, allows us to lay out those statements, give that guidance, and provide that level of detail that keeps all of us moving in the same direction, addressing those business requirements, and equally importantly, as Daniel suggested, those regulatory and statutory concerns that the business is going to face. It does provide that common language that we all need to speak and use as a reference point, that culture of security that I keep mentioning. Very, very important. Now, there are lots of different examples of security frameworks, right? I mean, there are many, many of them. And not all of them, by the way, are applicable to every organization. And not all of them are applicable in every circumstance. There's different silos that we operate in. There's frameworks that deal with, for instance, financial reporting. Things like the Basel Accords, Sarbanes-Oxley, what we call Sarbox here in the US, or SOX, you hear it referred to different ways. The COSO framework are just some examples, right? In information security, one of the most common and well-known ones is ISO 15408. You might not know it by that number, but it is referred to commonly as the common criteria. It's a very important one. We'll talk more about it in upcoming episodes. There's also ISO 27000 as a series. There are many of the standards within that series, some dealing with cloud security. The first two in particular are very important for our discussion here, ISO 27001 and 27002. ISO 27001 deals with the establishment of and the architecture and overarching thought process of the ISMS, the Information Security Management System. ISO 27002, the control elements that are applied through the 27001 ISMS architecture to enable us to apply it and create the opportunity for it to work within the organization. So these are just some of the frameworks, right, that we could theoretically offer Daniel and all of you as options. And another really important one you want to focus on, the NIST cybersecurity framework, becoming very, very important today, along with things like the NIST privacy framework and the risk management framework. You've heard us talk about some of them, and some will become up in other episodes, equally and all very important. But again, a one-size-fits-one, perhaps a one-size-fits-many solution. Many organizations implement ISO 27000 standards. Many are aligned with the RMF, the risk management framework from NIST. NIST SP 837 R2, about to be R3, is where the RMF comes from. Any and all of these are applicable, but only if you have a need for them and only if they address concerns you're worried about.
Yeah. Now, we have a couple that we need to call out specifically so that we understand and make sure that we can answer maybe, I don't know, a questionnaire of some sort about said frameworks. And they do have some fun names. And I'm speaking specifically of the idea of like SAPSA, right? SAPSA is one of these. Let's start there. Let's move into what do we need to know about SAPSA?
Sure. So SAPSA, right? The Sherwood Applied Business Security architecture is going to be, if it's a mouthful, it is, as you can see here, right, as we look at our key points document, keeping us online with where we are. We've kind of already addressed governance at a high level, but I listed SAPSA. Daniel is bringing us to that point. He's going to ask us and remind us to talk about Togaf and Zachman if I forget as well. There are additional frameworks, but all of these are ones that you should drill down a little bit on and make sure that you're aware of them. I've put into the episode notes some detailed discussions on all three. I've also included some overview documents, PDFs and things like that that come from the organizations that are behind SAPSA, Togaf, and or the Zachman Framework that'll help you to round out your knowledge, comfort, and awareness of them. Remember our mantra here, right, is mile wide. The knowledge base is very, very broad, but inch deep. We don't have to become an expert in SAPSA or Togaf or Zachman in order to be able to answer questions on the CISSP exam, but we have to have enough familiarity, comfort, and awareness around and with each of these frameworks in particular in order to ensure that if we're asked about them, and I'll explain what I mean about this in just a second, that we can speak knowledgeably to them and answer questions about them. So for instance, when we think about SAPSA, we're thinking about a business thought process that is risk-driven, focused around identification and management and the understanding of risk in the organization, as all of these are at some level, making sure we create architectures that address this at both the enterprise and solutions level, meaning at the business level, as well as at the solution level, the application of that through the business in terms of solving problems. There are a series of integrated frameworks that SAPSA kind of invites us to work with and presents for us as frames of reference. They deal with things like business requirements engineering, and the business requirements engineering framework is known as the attribute profiling. There are things like risk and opportunity management. There are things like policy architecture, security services oriented architecture, the governance, security domain frameworks, and the life cycle for service management and performance management frameworks. All of these make up the elements of SAPSA. And what you see in SAPSA is that there are two distinct elements. They're presented as a table traditionally. You'll see the table in the notes. On the left-hand side of the table, there will be a column labeled as the business view. And there are 6 elements underneath the business view. You'll see the business view, the architecture view, the designer view, the constructor's view, technician view, manager's view, all the views. It's not labeled business view, I should say. It's a table, and the column on the left should be labeled views, is what I meant to say. But the business view will be the one at the top. And then aligned with every view on the right will be the architectures that go with them. And you'll see that there are going to be contextual, conceptual, logical, physical, component, and management in that order as I sneak a peek at my notes to make sure I get them correct, right? And so the idea here is that this table lets us walk through the view and the architecture, combining them together. So we understand that the business view is all about the contextual architecture, whereas the constructor's view is all about the physical architecture within the organization's infrastructure and its approach to risk management. This is how we understand, and frame our discussions with SAPSA. It's very important as you look at a framework like this, and as Daniel challenges us with his question and reminds us to look at these, that it's really, really important that we take that high-level view, meaning we understand what the views are, understand how they align with the architectures. That's mile wide, inch deep. Don't get into how you would apply SAPSA, because this is not an examination on being a SAPSA architect. It's an examination on security frameworks, and SAPSA just happens to be one of them. What we think about SAPSA as a linear flow, is the idea of strategy and planning, leading to design, leading to implementation, leading ultimately to managing and measuring. We want to think about that. You'll see that linear flow in the notes as you go back and review. That This 4-step linear process is really the secret to understanding how to prepare for the right level of information associated with SAPA. So SAPA is one framework, right? Yeah. Absolutely.
And it's super important. It looks like it's very legitimate and for what it's worth and what you use it for. But Togaf is much more fun to say because I don't know why, but Togaf just makes me happy to hear that. It might not make me happy to have to understand it, though, because some of these things can be a bit complex. They've got a lot of working bits to them. So, Adam, if you would, please help us understand Togaf a little bit.
I certainly can. So the Open Group Architecture Framework, Togaf, another interesting one. Again, these are, architectures and frameworks, right, as you could see there, that are available. You may or may not have heard of them before. That doesn't mean they're not important. It just means that your organization has not had a reason to explore using them, or you have not come into contact with them. Do a little bit of research, get comfort at the appropriate level, and you're fine, right? Just move on from there. But the ideas and concepts associated with Togaf, in some respects, are very similar. Togaf does have an architecture thought process aligned very closely with what we see in SAPA. There are 4 key architectures. I'll name them off for you in a minute. But the main components or concepts of Togaf really structure themselves around partitioning, around architecture, repositories, where we have the architectures and the elements of them, and a capability framework, which helps us to describe and understand the elements that we can bring to bear and act through. And so it's a similar thought process, but is coming at this from a slightly different perspective. When we think about architectures associated with Togaf, there are 4: the business architecture, the data architecture, the application architecture, and the technology architecture. They're broader in their coverage, and they roll up many of the categories and architecture elements that are a little bit more granular in SAPA, one of the ways to think about comparing the two. But ultimately, the same information and the same thought process that's in SAPA does make itself apparent in Togaf. So it is just essentially a competitive framework from another perspective, if you will.
All right, I like it. I can roll with that. Now, our next one, the Zachman Framework. I always want to say Zachman, and this one is a bit new for me. It's kind of slipped past my radar, so it'll be helpful for you to kind of, for myself, not just for our viewers out there, but for me as well, to get your take on what we need to understand about Zachman.
So the Zachman Framework has been around for a while as well, and it is kind of interesting because it's one of those ones that you tend to hear about, and you may have heard the name. It's a well-known framework, but it's also, of the 3 that we're focusing on, and more broadly the many, many that exist, it's also, when I say the most difficult, not because it is difficult to use, but it's the most difficult to get your hands around and really understand because it is hard to get an accurate, short, concise, descriptive summary that actually makes sense of what the Zachman Framework is. It is, the gentleman behind it, Mr. Zachman, has been very forthright about his opinion of summaries of his framework. He says, it's my summary, it's my framework, use my language. And his language is a little verbose, a little flowery, a little academic, and therefore a little bit hard, perhaps, for most of us to approach.
He's the Tolkien of security management frameworks.
He speaks a different language than most of us do. Let me put it that way. It is a very interesting framework. But what I would suggest is look at the notes. I've given you about a 1-paragraph or so summary of it, which is about as concise as I can make it. I have included a summary document from the Zachman website where you can get the most recent version of the framework and see it. It's got a wonderful graphic associated with it, but it is a very complex graphic. It's very hard to work with unless you spend some time with it. But the idea is that basically it applies to enterprises, really this idea, what Zachman says anyway, a logical structure for classifying and organizing the descriptive representations of an enterprise that are significant to the management of the enterprise, as well as to the development of the enterprise's systems, manual systems, as well as automated systems. I'm reading directly from his specific language and how he chooses to describe it. It's like a face punch, right? Right there, all right? Now, that's actually a relatively straightforward, simple explanation of Zachman. It is a little more involved. But from your perspective, what you want to know for the exam, honestly, Just know that it's one of the frameworks we think about. Maybe a one-sentence statement that it also focuses on architecture broken down by application and systems, looking at both manual and automation aspects for our ability to manage and ultimately at scale, describe and understand risk and how we operate. And really all three of these frameworks are designed to do that at some level. It's really just a question of whether you say tomato or tomato, or you point and say, I'd like the red thing that is actually a fruit and not a vegetable.
That's right.
However you choose to do that, they all mean the same thing. So when we think about frameworks, that's probably where we want to be, at least at this particular juncture.
Well, I think it was a really good introduction to this topic. And like you said, we don't have to become experts in these areas. We just need to be familiar with the terminology and the frameworks themselves. And that's why we took a look at things like what is information security management, we defined governance, and then a couple of those frameworks out of the gate, SAPA, Togaf, and of course, Zachman, right?
Zachman
Always good
Framework.
stuff. Well, it looks like we're at the end of this episode. More to come in our accelerated CISSP series, so we do expect to see you there. Until then, have yourself a great day.
Take care, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.